All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down tonight. Quick message for our internet audience at home. If at any time during this evening's presentation you would like to purchase a copy of either book, just call the number on your screen and we'll take care of that for you, and we can mail it to you wherever you are in the United States for free. Also, if during the question and answer period you have a question for Mr. Wilson or Mr. Enfield, you can call the number on your screen and we will get your question to them. This evening, Books and Books is very pleased to welcome Mr. Robert Wilson and Ms. Jill Enfield. Mr. Wilson is the editor of The American Scholar, a former editor of Preservation, the founding literary editor of Civilization, all three of which won national magazine awards during his tenure, a former book editor and columnist for USA Today, and a former editor at the Washington Post Book World. His previous books include The Explorer King and A Certain Somewhere, Writers on the Places They Remember. Tonight he will be presenting his new book, Matthew Brady, Portraits of a Nation. Also lecturing this evening is Ms. Jill Enfield, a fine art, editorial, and commercial photographer. Ms. Enfield is one of the most experienced and respected hand-coloring artists in the United States. She is also a world-renowned expert on historical photographic techniques, including several methods used by Matthew Brady before, during, and after the Civil War. We are also featuring Ms. Enfield's book, Jill Enfield's Guide to Photographic Alternative Processes. Starting us off this evening, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Robert Wilson.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me here to Books and Books. I've had a chance to hang around the store a bit today, and it's as great a store as advertised, and not by Books and Books itself. It occurred to me to write about Matthew Brady almost a decade ago when I was finishing my first book, a book about a 19th century Western explorer named Clarence King. King led one of the first great surveys of the American West. He assembled a team to work with him on the survey. One of the people that he asked to join his team was Timothy O'Sullivan, who was fast becoming one of the great American photographers of the 19th century. This was the first time photography had been used in a vast scientific project like this. O'Sullivan worked for Clarence King for about 3 years. O'Sullivan was also a protege of Matthew Brady. So when I started reading about O'Sullivan, it struck me that there was not a reliable and really first-rate biography of Brady, which surprised me given his importance. Jill, if you'll change the slide. I like promoting my book as long as possible, but this is a painting of Brady that was done by a friend of his in the 1850s. It's a very generous likeness of him, but he was an attractive fellow. The years since I started thinking about Brady and researching him have really taught me how little I knew about him when I first decided to write about him, and how little I knew that was accurate even after I'd read enough about him to write the proposal. One thing that should have struck me, given the industriousness of historians and of journalists like myself, was if there was not a good book about Matthew Brady, there might be a good reason why. And in fact, there are a couple of good reasons. For someone who was in the public eye for almost 50 years, he left a pretty shallow trail. This was true even though his name became a brand for portrait photography in the 19th century and for Civil War photography. And also in spite of the fact that he knew everybody important in his day and knew all the important journalists of his day. And finally, it seems odd given that he himself was dedicated to making photography making a visual historical record through photography, and yet he left very few records of his own. He didn't keep a journal. He didn't write a memoir. He wrote very few letters, and they were mostly pretty perfunctory. His business records were nearly non-existent. And a lot of what we know about him came late in life, Jill, if you will, when he spoke to a few journalists and friends at a time when the natural tendency of many people of a certain age is to embroider their past. This is a sketch that was done by a sculptor named James Edward Kelly. Brady talked to him at length in the last years of his life, and Kelly took it all down. When Brady had dropped into Kelly's studio on Washington Square in New York, and Kelly had kind of climbed down off a ladder where he's working on a massive sculpture, and he saw Brady sitting there and decided to do a quick sketch and handed it to him. Brady signed it, which there are not that many examples of his signature or of his handwriting, and handed it back to Kelly and said something like, "You've done better than my boys," meaning he'd gotten a better likeness than all of the photographers who'd worked for Brady. So this lack of primary sources was one reason why such an important cultural figure had no good biography. The second reason is that in the decades immediately after his death, this paucity of fact led certain writers to do more than embroider as Brady had done, but to sort of create facts out of whole cloth. So it was really a challenge to, number one, to find the basic information I needed to find to write a book, but then also to resist the many kind of too good to be true stories. So I said that there are things that I thought I knew about Brady that were wrong. And the main one is the thing that I think all of us think we know about Brady, which is that he was not a Civil War photographer, but in some sense he was the Civil War photographer. That all the images we know of from the Civil War are photographs that Brady took, and especially those images that are used over and over again, Jill, if you will, that have sort of become even more familiar in the last couple of years as the 150th anniversary of the war has rolled along. This is one that Brady did take at after a couple of weeks after Gettysburg. It's called Three Confederate Prisoners. And if you'll click it one more time, Jill, a picture that is also iconic is this one taken at Antietam by Brady's Washington Gallery manager, Alexander Gardner, and which was displayed in Brady's New York gallery. It's theoretically possible, given this kind of small number of iconic pictures, that one person could have gone around from battle to battle and made the images we best know. And it's especially true because some of the war's really signal events had no photographers present at all. As I'm about to tell you, Brady was present at Bull Run, but no photographs exist from Bull Run. And there was no photographer at Appomattox. They were all in Richmond photographing the ruins of the burnt-out city, and nobody managed to get to Appomattox at the great historical moment. And in fact, there are no photographs at all of actual fighting. So Brady did not himself actually travel from battle to battle, although he was at the first battle at Bull Run, as I've said, and was likely the first man in history to take photographs under fire. I say likely because he was seen by various people, reported seeing him there attempting to take photographs. But as I said, none exist. What seems to be likely again to have happened was that in the chaotic retreat from Bull Run by the Union forces, Brady had said he had taken 2 wagons of equipment to Bull Run to, to photograph the battle. there was an incredible chaos in the middle of the afternoon as the Union forces retreated, and wagons were overturned, spilled out. Things were spilled out. Horses and mules were stolen so people could get back to the safety of Washington. And it seems likely that Brady's images were destroyed at that time. Several publications, including the New York Times, wrongly reported that he had brought photographs back from the battlefield, and that, I think, is more a testament to his growing skills as a PR person. He was able to show them things that weren't quite from the battle and convince them that they were. And we don't really know how Brady felt about Bull Run and being under fire, but what we do know is he didn't go back to another battlefield for over 2 years. So draw your own conclusions. He went to Gettysburg a couple of weeks, as I said, after that battle. And then he was not on a battlefield again until after Cold Harbor, another year later. He was there, and then at Petersburg, the Union Army went over to Petersburg, and he was there at the growing stalemate there for a few days. That's really it for Brady in Civil War battles, although he did go to he was one of the photographers who went to Richmond after the war, Jill, if you will. And on Easter, wait a minute, I'm getting behind myself. Getting behind. I wanted to tell you that he did come back from Bull Run and have this, I think, heroic photograph of himself taken the next morning after the Bull Run battle. And you see it's inked on it that the photographer returned from Bull Run. One of the things I say in my book that got a lot of pickup by reviewers was something like, what did Brady think war was that he would dress for it like a French landscape painter? In fairness, journalists often wore those dust coats like he has on. And one thing that's interesting about the picture is behind his hand there's a sword, the outline of a sword sticking out, and it was quite likely that he claimed that the New York fire zouaves had given him the sword for protection, and it was pretty clear from the accounts of that day that protection was needed. All right, try it again, Jill, and we'll see what else I might have missed. Okay, this is the picture I wanted to be at now. So Brady was in Richmond the day that Robert E. Lee returned from Appomattox. He kind of wandered back. Lee got to Richmond, where his wife was living, on Easter Saturday, and that was the day that Abraham Lincoln died. Lincoln had been shot the night before, but he lived into the next morning. One of Lee's sons said there was nothing that Lee hated so much as to have his photograph made. So here he is. He comes back from defeat, from surrender. He gets to Richmond. He had to be tired in every possible way there is to be tired. He hated having his photograph made, and yet he agreed to do it. Brady talked to Lee's wife, and this picture was then taken the next morning, Easter Sunday morning, kind of under the back porch of the house in Richmond where Lee's wife was living. I think it had to do something with Lincoln's assassination, that even though it would be a while before this picture got generally known, it was an opportunity for Lee to sort of present himself as someone morphing back into a civilian. Whether it had to do specifically with Lincoln or not, he was often being approached by troops in those days after Appomattox and saying, let's don't give up. And he would say, no, go back to your farms, rebuild your lives. And here's a picture of him, I think, visibly becoming a civilian. He actually has street shoes on, which you can't quite see in this picture, but in some of the others taken that morning. And it's not, it's sort of partial uniform. It's interesting the way Brady framed this particular shot. You can see the cross of the door right behind Lee's head, and that had a lot of impact on the South's thinking of Lee as a kind of Christian martyr. So that picture became famous for that. Still, as many as 10,000 photographs are attributed to Brady. And how can that be if Brady wasn't there himself? To understand it, you have to go back to the beginning of the daguerreotype era almost, Jill, if you will, when Brady had a studio on Lower Broadway in Manhattan. This was Broadway at Fulton Street near St. Paul's Church. It's about 2 blocks from the present World Trade Center site. To run a daguerreotype studio in those days took a lot of help. It was a little bit like running a big bookstore like this. And you needed people to prepare the plates, to polish the plates before preparing them. There were people called operators who actually stood behind the camera. There were people who would color the plates and people who would put them in a leather case for the visitors. So Brady was not the guy that stood behind the camera. The operator did that. Brady was the owner of the studio. He made the big aesthetic choices and technical choices. He greeted and would sometimes pose the sitters. And he did a lot of, early on he knew that he wanted to take pictures of famous people. And that both, I think, because of his of a heartfelt interest in history, but also as a kind of business strategy, he felt that associating himself with the well-known was a good way to go. Jill, if you will. One person he did photograph, this is a daguerreotype actually, that he took in 1851 of Michael Faraday, the great British scientist. Brady and his wife were in England and Europe in the early 1850s, and he pursued Faraday and got this photograph of him. Jill, if you would. Soon he began to hang these pictures of the famous on the walls of his studio. This is a slightly later studio than one I showed you, but so in his reception rooms there would be these framed pictures of the famous. And if you walked in off the street on Broadway and to look at these pictures, you might be able to imagine yourself there among them and would go up another level and have Brady make your photo. All of these photos that were made in his studio, whether he was there or not, were known as photos by Brady. He was called Brady of Broadway in those years. And that was really, his name was his brand. This isn't very hard to understand, I don't think, in a business context. We know many businesses are named for their owners, and everything that is produced by a business is not produced by the individual whose name is on it. But I think in the context of photography and a photographer, where we think of a photographer as being an individual, it has led to some misunderstanding, a sense that Brady somehow took credit for work that wasn't his, that other people took the photographs and Brady got the credit. By the time the Civil War began, Brady had a New York studio for 17 years, and he had a studio in Washington that he'd started in 1858 for several years. He'd kept up with the rapid changes in technology. One thing that came soon after the daguerreotype, Jill, if you will, is what's known as a daguerreotype on glass, or an ambrotype. This is an advance in the technology of photography. Both daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, though, are one-of-a-kind photographs. They were not reproducible unless you would re-daguerreotype or re-ambrotype them. But soon enough, the ability to the glass negative process, wet plate process, came along and created negatives that could be reproduced in large numbers. Probably the most famous photograph Brady took, Jill, was this one of Abraham Lincoln, which he took on the day that Lincoln, who was a presidential candidate, or was being whispered about as a presidential candidate at the time, gave his famous Cooper Union speech, which convinced the nation that he was presidential timber. The welcoming party for Lincoln took him for a walk on the day of the speech, and they walked him down Broadway and into Brady's studio. The picture was widely reproduced, and I think did a lot to humanize Brady, possibly because of the heroically wrinkled suit he has on that had just come out of his valise. He'd been on the train from Springfield for a number of days. But I think it humanized him. And later, after Lincoln was elected and had come to Washington before the inauguration, he went to Brady's Washington studio and supposedly said, "Brady and the Cooper Union made me president." Well, the only source for this is Matthew Brady, so make of it what you will. After the southern states seceded and after Fort Sumter, northern militia units were called to Washington by President Lincoln. He asked for 75,000 troops to protect the capital from the South. But I would say at least half the people in the South, in the capital, were Southern sympathizers. So he was not being, he was rightfully concerned. Apparently he said, "When will they come? When will they come?" waiting for the troops. Although some of the troops got there quite quickly. Jill, when the troops got there, they camped around Washington. At one point, there were as many as 300 encampments around Washington for various units. And the men there would sometimes go to Brady's studio and have photographs made. And Brady began to send his operators out into the field for the first time to take what amounted to studio photographs made out of doors. This one is of Colonel then Ambrose Burnside, who had become a famous general later. Part of Brady's impulse here had to do with his continuing interest in history, but these photographs were also something that sold well. So there was an economic interest in doing it. And he began to send more and more teams of operators out to take photographs for his growing collection. After Bull Run, this practice continued, and he would send photographers with the Union armies, and they would send back pictures. And a couple of photographers, including Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, went to work for the Union Army and were taking photographs of orders or maps they would reproduce that way, or go out and take pictures of possible sites for hospitals or other kinds of infrastructure. So all of these pictures, when they were doing that, they were still sending pictures back to Brady. He was collecting all these photographs and amassing them. Jill, if you will, one of Brady's photographers followed, James Gibson followed the Union Army on the Peninsula Campaign. This picture was taken after the 7 days at a hospital at a place called Savage Station. This is an example of a stereograph. I blew it up in a way so that at least one of the two images would be sort of big enough to see, but you can see the image begins to repeat itself on the right side. Stereographs, maybe Jill will tell you more about them, but they were had two lenses, and they were often sort of the distance apart of the human eyes, and you would look at them on a device that would give you a 3D effect, and they were also very popular. This is also one of the first pictures that really brought home to the public the cost of war. Harper's Weekly wrote about the photo. This scene brings the war to those who have not seen it. How patiently and still they lie, these brave men who bleed and are maimed for us. It is a picture which is more eloquent than the sternest speech. So Brady sold all these photographs that his men sent back. He also copied and added to his collection photos others had taken, sometimes with permission and sometimes without permission. It's hard to justify him copying other people's work, but it was widely done. It was not only done by him, it was often also done to him. So by any means available, Brady accumulated Civil War photographs. To me, one of the great values in his life and what he did is that he did create this huge trove that some of these pictures were later sold to the federal government. And so we have I think Brady is very, very much responsible, even though he didn't himself take a lot of the pictures, for the huge collection of Civil War photographs we have. It should also be said, I think, that many of the other most important photographers of the war did work for Brady at one time or another. Late in life, he told a reporter, "I had men in all parts of the Army like a rich newspaper." There aren't a lot of rich newspapers left anymore, but I guess there were some in those days. It wasn't true in a literal sense in that he had many, many teams all over the war. But I think as he looked back on it, all of these guys were still his men, even if they did not all work for him at the same time. I'll just mention one more thing, which is one of the other misconceptions about Brady. This really grew out of the things that you now know yourself, and didn't come from people trying to make a good story out of the sketchy materials of his life, but from scholars and curators of photography who thought about these things I've told you, that Brady rarely operated the camera himself, that he got credit for the work of others, and that he accumulated photographs that were in no sense his. Plus, there was Brady's suspicious entrepreneurial zeal, a little too close to comfort to that of his neighbor across Broadway, Jill, Phineas T. Barnum. Brady worked with Barnum, and certainly he was the official photographer of Tom Thumb's wedding, and certainly a lot of Barnum's entrepreneurial zeal rubbed off on Brady. So I think these academics often thought if Brady was a huckster, then he couldn't be a real artist. And so there grew up in the 20th century a sort of counter-narrative about Brady, that he really wasn't a photographer at all. I think this is pretty silly, and the tide is beginning to shift back to what I think is a more reasonable way of looking at him. And I hope my book will help move that change along. Thank you.
Folks, we're going to take a very brief pause for about a minute or two so they could change the presentation for the internet, for the live stream presentation. So just give us 1 or 2 minutes. All right, folks, welcome back. For the next portion of our presentation, Jill Enfield's Guide to Photographic Alternative Processes. Please welcome to the microphone Ms. Jill Enfield.
Thank you. And I also want to thank Mitchell and Books and Books and the staff here. They've been really fantastic, and it's wonderful to be here with someone I went to high school with, actually camp. So we've known each other for a very long time. So I am what's called a historical techniques photographer. I like using techniques that still use the darkroom and things that have been done since the beginning of photography. So I wrote this book on how to do these techniques, and the book has about 106 other photographers illustrated in the book, and with examples and very easy instructions so that people that have never done things before can do them. What I would like to do, though, is to have Bob push the button, but before you push the button, I'll explain what you're going to see, which is a 2-minute video on how to make a wet plate collodion image, a portrait like Matthew Brady and his crew did during the Civil War. It's a quick time, so I look like Charlie Chaplin. It's really about a 30-minute process. Okay, now you may push the button. No? Okay. Now you can push to the next one. Thank you. Oh, yeah, get off that. So that's an example of how it's done with a portable darkroom. What Matthew Brady would have done is he would have had a wagon that was pulled, or a tent. Sometimes they had wagons depending on how far they were going, and sometimes they had tents. Now what I do is that box weighs 43 pounds, and I can't bring it with me on an airplane. So when I travel, I have an ice fishing tent, which is dark enough for me to use as a regular darkroom tent, and that's how I get to where I need to be going with the same chemicals. And luckily now we can send them through FedEx instead of having them maybe spill, with a mule carrying them. So it's a little bit easier now, but it still can be difficult. And it is, they are hazardous. So you have to send them in specific ways. But it's so much fun, and it's such a wonderful experience to be doing these kinds of processes, and I love it. It's great. So now you can push the button, but you might have to push 2 to get away from the movie. Yeah, now push another one. Okay. So what I'm doing now is I'm showing you a few images done actually by a man named Richard Barnes, who photographed with National Geographic magazine for the 150-year anniversary of the Civil War, doing it actually using my equipment for the shoot. Bob? So these images can be seen on the National Geographic site. And what's funny, and maybe we can find out from Bob afterwards with questions, is what we had learned in our photo history classes is that not only did he take pictures during the battles, or at the sidelines of the battles, but also during the battles, which seems to not be correct feeling now. And we were told that the reason why these images don't exist is because a lot of the glass had to be repurposed after the Civil War for greenhouses, and that, they don't exist any longer. And so that's why we don't really see them. But apparently that is a falsehood. Push. So these images done by Richard were sort of funny. If you take a look at this image, there are cars in the background. So he didn't want people to think that he was absolutely copying Matthew Brady and his troops, but that he was shooting the reenactments now. And so he has all of the reenactors, but with modern day things happening all around them, the cars and other people that are the tourists that are watching the reenactors. It's I don't know if anyone has ever been to Gettysburg, but it's really an amazing sight. And they walk around in the middle July 4th with these wool dresses on and uniforms, and it's quite incredible. But so he included them within all of the images so that you could really tell. And he set himself up on the sidelines to take a lot of these images, but they were still done during battle times. So the battles are happening around him, but with cars following as well. Yeah, and porta potties. Whatever was needed. And the blurs are from the fact that this process is very slow. It can be the exposures are anywhere from 1 second to 45 seconds, depending on what time of day and if you're inside or outside. And I don't know if any of you noticed in the image that Bob showed of General Lee, but besides him being in the middle of the door, if you looked where his legs were, there was a stand there. And that stand would have had a headrest to hold him so that he would have been in focus during a long exposure. So a lot of what you're seeing also, he did do tin types, ferrotypes, which are actually on aluminum. They're black background, usually, not all the time. And so you're seeing the actual scratching and whatever other artifacts are in the image. And platers, they're called. Wet platers had these artifacts in them as well in the 1800s, but most of them were covered by mats, usually round mats around the image. So just the center of the image was shown. But it's something like this, seeing the smoke of the cannonballs would not necessarily have been, would not have been shown because they weren't at the battles at the time. You've totally ruined my image of what it was like. Push away. Thank you. So I love the fact that it shows all of these blurs. And photographers, when we were shooting film before, and even now, sometimes digitally, if you have a slow shutter speed, that's how you would get these blurs. But at the time, with collodion, it's so slow, you couldn't do anything about it. If someone was moving, they would show no matter what. You can hit again. Okay, so this image is done by a friend of mine named Barat from Slovenia, and what he's showing is on your right side is a negative on glass. So it's not on the aluminum, it's on a regular piece of glass, window glass, and they are done twice as thick as what a tintype would look like. They've been exposed twice as long, developed twice as long. And it is so, at the same time, collodion became popular, so did something called albumen printing and salt printing. And so albumen is egg whites, and it was mixed with kosher salt. And kosher salt is not really kosher. I found that out as well. I'm just blown away by all this. But it's just regular salt, but it's big grained salt. And so the image on your left is a print made from that negative. And that's usually how people, even today, are showing these images, because that's how it was done in the 1800s, was you made a negative, and then you made these salt prints or albumen prints. And that is how Brady sold all of his images. He would make those salt prints and albumen prints. So this is up there for you to read, but I will read it also. In his biography of Matthew Brady, Robert Wilson asked, does asking whether implicitly or explicitly how we can tell the photographer from the photograph make these images works of art? And I feel that the answer is yes. Many artists today have been inspired by Matthew Brady's artistic vision and methods, creating their own signature style. And that's something that photography that question has been asked of photography forever, whether it's an art form or whether it's just there to capture a true life moment. And I think now, especially with Photoshop, everything that is captured is not necessarily true. And people decide how they compose, what they're putting into their image, and that in itself makes something an artistic expression, for me anyway. So I'm going to show you some images that are in my book that illustrate a lot of these processes. This first one is a salt print from a collodion negative, and this is done, you're looking at a daylight studio similar to what Matthew Brady made. Because daguerreotype and collodions were so slow, And dry plate collodions, which came next, were also extremely slow. They needed a lot of light. So most of the photographer studios were on the top floor, and they made skylights in their studios, and so that the light could come through and they could make exposures.
Could you tell us what collodion is?
Sure. It is a chemical. Collodion is actually from gun cotton, and it was used during the Civil War as a Band-Aid. It's almost like a plastic, and in this case, Frederick Scott Archer invented it as a photographic process. In 1851, he mixed collodion and ether and a couple of bromides and other chemicals, and then they figured out by putting that on either aluminum or glass and then putting it with silver nitrate, the organic material of the collodion made the silver nitrate light sensitive, and so they would dunk it into the silver nitrate for a few minutes and then take it out, immediately put it into a plate holder, photograph it with it while it was wet. That's why it's called wet plate. And then they would take it right back into their tent and develop it. So it was the Polaroid of the 1800s because they could see it immediately. You're welcome. Okay, so this is an image taken at Lacock Abbey in England, and this is where Fox Talbot, the Fox Talbot Museum is. I don't know if you guys know who Fox Talbot was, but he, along with Daguerre and Niepce and all of these people from photo history, he did a lot of experiments, and he's the one that has where you have a negative and then you can make another sensitive emulsion on paper, and you can make prints, and that's how we are able to get multiple images. And if you're ever in England, Lacock Abbey is about an hour and a half from London, and it's absolutely outstanding. And also, really, really an important fact is that Harry Potter was filmed there. So you have to go. But it's a wonderful museum, and this image was photographed there by Mark Osterman. This is an example of a jewel case, which most of the daguerreotypes and collodions and tintypes were shown. People would buy their image and then put them in these wonderful jewel cases and take them with them. They're usually leather and embossed and quite lovely. In the 1800s, it would usually say the studio's name, also embossed. So this is Craig Barber, and this is also a wet plate collodion. This is a tintype. And when I say a tintype, it means, again, that it was done on aluminum instead of glass, and so it's a positive image. And with all of these images, if you don't varnish them, they get dark. So a lot of times if you'll see old tintypes at an antique store and they're very, very dark or they're cracked, it's because they weren't varnished properly. So a lot of photographers are staying with portraits and normal sorts of images that they did in the 1800s, and then still others are branching out and just using collodion just like they would film or digital. So this particular image is actually a set of pieces. Those grids are done. Each one of those is a separate tintype done by Gail Stevens. And it was actually done with an enlarger. So in the 1800s, there were no enlargers. There were sun enlargers where they would, and it would take hours and hours to make an exposure. Now we have, I'm sure you've heard photographers say, oh, well, I have an enlarger or not. And so she's doing it with a modern type enlarger. Processes from the 1800s, enlargers from the 20th century. Sometimes she will scan them in from the 21st century. So Stephen uses alternative processes mainly in commercial work. He's the one that does all of the, if you see tintypes in movies, anytime anyone's looking at a tintype or what's called a carte de visite, it's an image of, it's like a business card of today. But they had people's likenesses on the card. When they visited their friends, they would leave a calling card. So anytime you see anything like that, it's usually done by Stephen. So David was teaching Photo 1. Photo 1 students shoot an awful lot of film. So he goes into the darkroom and he sees all of these. The one on the right that says T-Max 400, that's what the film comes in, and he just straightened it out. And he did something called Japanning, which is what they did to make a aluminum back in the day. And what it is you take asphalt, just like how we make our streets, and they then cooked it. And I can't believe David does this because it's quite disgusting. And so he japanned the front, and then he photographed all of his students. And then this is how he showed them. He makes these beautiful boxes. So one thing I wish I could do is woodwork. I mean, it's just magnificent. So Brooke is using them for fashion photography. In order to expose like this in a studio, in a fashion studio, she has to use lights that are probably 10 times brighter than the lights you're seeing here. And she pretty much blinds her subject. It gives it a real big pop. They go like that, and hopefully she got the image. This is France Scully Osterman. She did, she will shoot with an 8x10 and make collodion as her subject sleeps. And then she makes digital negatives, and then she makes salt prints that are life-size. Yeah, they're beautiful. Jen Jansen, instead of using black aluminum, she'll use colored aluminum. So you see how people are doing the same process, but really expanding upon it, which I think is really exciting. So this is Bharat, and in real life, this guy is a librarian in a very small town in Slovenia. And in 2001, he started taking pictures and started a very large festival of documentary photography and was the art director for 7 years and has now become a very famous editorial photographer in Slovenia. And he uses collodion pretty much as a jumping off point, and then he'll scratch through his negatives and draw on the collodion in a very similar way that a lot of artists did in the 1970s. Okay. This is Jody Ake. There's a portrait of John Legend, and he shot it with film, and then he made it into an ambrotype, which is a wet plate positive. And then he scanned it back in, and he added color in Photoshop. So he, again, is going through all the different centuries of photography and mixing and matching and adding whatever he wants to add, depending on what what's needed at the time. And this is his again. He photographed, this is called the Velvet Hammer Burlesque Dancers for a goth magazine. The images, again, were shot on film and then turned into ambrotypes with his enlarger. The color was added in Photoshop. And he says, needless to say, he had a fun weekend. Carrie Ware was a student of mine, and she started shooting weddings and engagement pictures with the collodion, and has gotten an amazing amount of work doing this. People love it. This is actually one of mine, and one of the things I like is I couldn't get myself into the photograph totally like Matthew Brady did, but you can see my shadow. So this was, I got to go to Italy to shoot this wedding, which was quite wonderful. And this is my tent in Italy. This is in Santa Fe. I was teaching a workshop, and a lot of times if you don't have a tent and you don't have a dark room, you just make one. So this is a box in the back of a car, and it works just as well as anything else. So it doesn't take that much to be able to do these strange processes. Oops, sorry, I lost my place. So this, if I can get over here, then I can read it too. Wet plate collodion portraits made today can be a metaphorical reference to the courageous traveler of the 19th century. So what this is the beginning of is some of my portraits that I'm doing of immigrants. I'm from an immigrant family. I'm first generation American, as are two of my cousins that are here in the back. And our parents, our fathers came over from Germany in 1939 and opened up the first camera store on Miami Beach, and called Enfield. What I started to do is take pictures of immigrants that were in my neighborhood. I live in New York City. Almost everybody you bump into is an immigrant or knows an immigrant. And so I started to photograph them, and I thought that I should do it in a way that mirrored what the journey is like. So even though they can hop on a plane now, and it might not be as arduous as it was in the 1800s or 1900s, it's still pretty difficult to become an immigrant, and just pick up and leave. And so I photographed them with the wet collodion technique, even though most of the immigrants that were photographed on Ellis Island were dry plate. I'm using wet plate. But it's I like it better, and I think it sort of tells the same kind of story. So all of these people have come from different places. I interview them. They tell me their stories. I have a writer interview them as well, and then the show will hopefully be up on Ellis Island when this is called The New Immigrants, and I'm hoping that Ellis Island will be able to finish their renovations since Hurricane Sandy, and they're having a new wing that is also called The New Americans. So this is my darkroom. Everybody always asks me, you have a darkroom in New York City. So this is my normal darkroom when I'm not traveling. And it used to be a kitchen. It has a window. I have a big red filter over it, and it is quite wonderful to use. These are some of my students using my portable darkroom during a workshop in Maine. You're very good at that, Bob. And this is supposed to be the second movie. Is that possible? This is also just 2 minutes. I actually think it's a little less. All right. Well, I just had another quote. You don't have to see me taking a picture. Which was, Picasso said that every child is an artist, and the problem is how to remain an artist once you grow up. And that is it. And that's me. Thank you.
Remember, if you have a question for Mr. Wilson or Ms. Enfield, please raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone. Mr. Wilson, if you want to come back up to the podium so we can hear you on the microphone. Well, maybe I'll start, and this is a very rudimentary question that people who know about people who know about photography will probably find this question pretty jejune, but what influence did Matthew Brady have, if any, on Ansel Adams? Do we know?
Do you want to answer that? Do you want me to?
Why don't you try?
I'll try. I don't know if I'll be able to. I think it was, it's more that at the time that these photographers were working in the 1800s, it was the beginning of photography. So I think that they have influenced everybody during all the ages. And so this was the first time, when you think about it, that people were photographing portraits of other people. Before that, they were just paintings, and they were also. It was also the first time that people could ever see. Remember, not everyone traveled. In fact, very few people traveled, and so it was the first time places that were foreign to people in the United States and in Europe could see places, faraway lands, or even anything that could be put down on paper, and they could own a piece of a landscape or a portrait of somebody. So that's what I think. Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I do think of Brady as being really, truly a portrait photographer from beginning to end. He had not much interest himself in landscapes. When his guys were out in the field, they would tend to take pictures of landscapes. Then when Brady got there, they would suddenly take portraits again. And since I think of Adams really as being a landscape photographer, I don't see a great connection there, except in the fact that, you know, Brady just created the idea of photography in the American psyche.
One moment.
Just a practical question. What's the commercial application of this today, as you see it?
Well, a lot of people are doing it editorially. They're doing it for everything, fashion, wedding, anything. There a lot. It seems that photographers, you know, it's when digital first came out, everybody just was so thrilled with the fact you didn't have to get wet again. And now people, it's very romantic. It's brings up your passion to see that those images come up in the water. And I think that people just want to go back, and you can have a choice of being able to do anything now. And especially because we do have scanners, so you can make these images, and then you don't have to spend all of that time doing the salt prints or the albumin prints. You scan in your glass plate or your tintype, and you can make as many copies as you want. You can put them up on the web, and it's a much easier way to get the work out there, but still being able to use whatever medium you want to be able to use.
Any more questions? No? All right, folks, then if there are no more questions, a reminder for our internet audience that if you call the number on your screen, you could purchase either of tonight's books. We'll have the authors sign them for you, and we can mail it to wherever you are free of charge. And by the way, all of our live stream events are archived. So if you were to visit the Books and Books website and go to the live stream link, any presentation that's been live streamed here from the store will be archived, and you could watch it whenever you wish. For those of you here in the store tonight, we have both books for sale at the counter over there. Mr. Wilson and Ms. Enfield will be signing over there at the table to the left of the screen. This was a fascinating presentation. Please give them a big hand. Thanks very much.